So I'm Tayler, as I said before, and I'm at Strathclyde Uni doing my PhD, looking into alienation, but specifically kind of mental health. And I'm looking into that in kind of clerical office-based work, looking at trade union intervention and how that can mediate alienation and work-related mental health issues, and specifically doing this in a kind of COVID-19 setting, because just as I went to start collecting data, the pandemic happened. So there wasn't very much I could do about it, but it's actually brought quite a lot to the study, I think, hopefully. So very basic stuff here, a little introduction to Marx himself. The main kind of Marx text, kind of 1840s, and he was writing in a time where factory work was kind of booming. So you had the bourgeoisie, or the ruling class, who were the people who owned the means of production, that quote that you hear all the time, and the proletariat, or the working class. And he was essentially looking at the struggle of the working class and the fact that they had to sell their labor to survive, and the conditions that the bourgeoisie were putting these people under in order to gain the most profit out of them. Around this time, the other political writers, it was people like Ricardo and Adam Smith, and they'd sort of stopped when they hit capitalism, these writers. They kind of got there and they all start talking about how capitalism is natural and it's right, and it's what humans were always going to evolve to in a political system. And Marx kind of went against them and said, you only think of workers as being animals. One of the most kind of famous quotes there at the bottom is the one that I think kind of sums up the topic of alienation and Marx's theories in general the most. So capitalism only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. Kind of a motto of the same collective, I would assume, as well in some ways. So alienation specifically is a Marxist theory of labor. Marx took Feuerbach's theory of species being, which Feuerbach was a religious writer, and he was basically saying what makes us human and different from animals is our propensity to love. And Marx and Engels came along and said, no, labor is what makes us uniquely human. It is the fact that we can control our labor, we can pre-plan our labor, we have freedom over what we make, and it's not instinctual. And according to Marx, under capitalism, alienation is going to be inevitable because that creativity that we are supposed to have is gone, essentially, or is controlled by somebody else. So the 5 types of labour alienation that we're going to be going through, as I know that Penny had sent out in the email. So there's alienation from nature, alienation from the labour process, from the products of our labour, from others, and then from ourselves, our kind of own selves. All of these contribute to this alienating us from our species being, or our human nature. So the first one here, alienation from nature. Marx thought that labour was essentially a process in which humans and nature participate. We take what is around us and we make it into tools, we make it into something useful for ourselves. Under capitalism, that obviously comes with a price and it becomes profitable and everything has a value. The labour that we do, according to Marx, isn't instinctual in the same way as it is for animals. So a spider isn't going to get together with another spider and, for example, say, let's build a web together and we can make a bit better web, but humans are able to do that with each other. We're able to say, right, that maybe wasn't the best what we did there. Let's get together, let's make something better, let's be more creative, let's improve. And yet this treating nature as a commodity, I've got the example there of private ownership of land, but I've also got the wee image there of a bottle of water, because I think this kind of sums it up more than anything, the fact that we've taken water, something that is completely natural and necessary to us, packaged it in plastic, which is obviously also horrendous for the planet, and then we sell it, we've branded it, we sell it to people. You can have different prices for different quality of water. So I think in terms of alienation from nature, that's potentially one of the best examples there. So the next slide here, alienation from the labour process. So again, labour was the way that we work on the world around us, and that process itself is what makes us human. While we sell our labour to survive though, we've no longer got that creativity or the kind of spontaneity, as Marx says, but our labour and the process that we're following is somebody else's. The example I've got for this here is call centres, which a lot of my research is focused on. Call centres, you've obviously got, for example, people with scripts. So even though their entire job is based around speaking to somebody, their managers or employers don't even trust people to create their own conversation. Instead, it's right, here's a script and you've got a target and you need to get through all this in a certain amount of time. And if you don't hit, you need to try and minimize how long you're on the phone so that we can make as much as we possibly can off of it. And then I just double check, can you mute that other, just because it's constantly crackling.
Yeah, if everybody could please mute their, so that we don't have, yeah?
Perfect.
That would be great.
Sorry. So yeah, Marx says in this, the worker only feels himself when he's not working. So instead of being able to kind of fulfill ourselves in our work and being able to do things that are going to build us and make us feel good about ourselves, instead it's forced because we need to do this to survive and we're not able to kind of put any of our real selves into it. So alienation from the product. This one's quite interesting when you look at kind of globalization and things like that. The quote from Swain there is really good. Products that we produce are being sold to somebody else, by somebody else to make profit for someone else. Nothing that we ever make under capitalism or at work under capitalism is technically ours. If you look at, for example, people who are making designer clothes or who are making electronics in factories across the world, they're making products or making parts of products that on their wages they'll never actually be able to afford. Even though their energy and their effort has gone into making that, they themselves will never actually be able to have the finished product of their labour. In that same sense, somebody who makes a part for a phone, there's no real fulfilment in that because then it just gets put back into the labour process and it becomes a part in somebody else's labour. It's never really got that finished product status. It becomes a part again. So this is how we get to this kind of idea that Marx talked about commodity fetishism. So this was quite an important part, like an important concept of his writings. And essentially what he was saying is, it's not the kind of throwaway culture of capitalism, it's the idea that everything that is made, every product is not thought of in terms of the effort that went into it or the energy. Instead, it's thought of purely in the capital value. So an example, I was trying to think of a good example for this not happening. And the one that I thought of was, for example, if somebody makes you a meal, a friend makes you a meal, you give them thanks, you appreciate the effort that they've put into it because you know that that's their time that went into that and their energy that went into that. And you don't sit there and think, I wonder how much I could sell this for, and what profit I could make off of this dinner. So then alienation from others. 2 seconds, I'm going to move our faces so I can see that. So this one is kind of interesting and it kind of links to a lot of big social issues. I feel like this is probably the section that you could talk the longest on. So we've got Marx's idea that within capitalism, there's always competition. So you've got competition between the capitalists and the workers, which is kind of a given. You've got people, workers trying to get better employment standards, higher wages, and you've got employers trying to drive that down so that they can make the most profits. But you've also got competition between capitalists there. So somebody who owns a big company, they can't let their profits slip because otherwise they get taken over in the market, their company gets swallowed up. And you've got competition as well then between the workers themselves, the labour force. And essentially we start viewing each other in this kind of capitalist way and comparing ourselves. I've got one of the, Swain talks about, it's on that slide there, we refer to each other in capitalist terms. I don't know how many times I've spoke about, my manager or my colleague. And that's nothing of value of that person. It's just where they fit in the capitalist structure of your working life. We start to see, neighbours and those around us as kind of competitors. You start going, oh, they're having a second holiday, they've got a new car, how can I not do that? And everything, again, is a commodity to be sold. So we are competing constantly with those around us, particularly now if we're looking at COVID and the job market shrinking. And this is, Ferguson links this to big, massive social issues, racism, homophobia, sexism, the kind of big, the competitive side of, well, I guess, struggle and poverty. People turn on each other. So the last one here, alienation from ourself or our human nature. Essentially this one, from most of the reading, is almost a kind of byproduct of the rest. If you're alienated from, all these other things, it's going to start weighing on your own mind. So labour is supposed to confirm our sense of self. If we can't do that, we can't confirm our sense of self. It's denied, as Marx says, the worker does not confirm himself in his work, but denies himself, feels miserable, does not develop free mental and physical energy, but mortifies his flesh and ruins his mind. There's no creativity, there's no self-expression. And within a capitalist society, that's where things like anxiety will creep in, because people often have this sense of, if you're not being fulfilled in your work and you're not able to use this propensity for labour that we've got in a useful way, there's a lot of anxieties that can creep in terms of, am I doing enough? Am I keeping up? Am I getting enough done with my life? Am I wasting my life? All these kind of things. And then finally down the bottom there, Allman actually links this back to the estrangement or the alienation from nature, in that he's kind of stating, or Marx says that we are nature ourselves. So if we're alienated from others and we're alienated from ourselves, that's further alienation from nature itself. Do a quick time check. I've just got 2 more slides, and essentially what I'm going to do now is link it to today or kind of contemporary work, and then start a little bit of an introduction on maybe things that could potentially help. But I think that's what the chat afterwards is mainly going to be about. So alienation in the modern day, this is a lot of the kind of things that I teach about at uni and a lot of the things that I do research on. So 0-hour contracts, which are probably going to be rising quite significantly post-COVID again. Some of the literature coming out on that, for example, Marx obviously was saying that we only kind of feel at home in our home lives. Well, when people are on 0-hour contracts, often they'll get shifts last minute, or they'll get shift drop last minute. So they actually won't even be in control of their own leisure time anymore. And they won't be able to pre-plan kind of creative things to do in that time. Emotional labour. So Arlie Hochschild started this kind of defined this concept in 1983. She was looking at flight attendants and bouncers and the kind of emotions that they portray at work, which are owned by their employer. So it's like your customer service voice. We see this a lot in call centres. As I said, people are scripted, but they still have to sound happy, even if they're not happy. Global outsourcing, again, if you're making a part of something, you will never, some people will never even see the finished product of what it is that their energy goes into. COVID-19, all the different ways of working at the moment. Ferguson talks about this in a recent paper, and it is very, very, very well written. kind of the alienating effects of furlough, working from home, being self-employed right now, anything, you know, unemployed, the risk of redundancy. Oops. And then finally there, mental health, which is where I'm obviously focused most. Again, Ferguson, but there's a whole group there of kind of social work and social policy academics, and they critique the entire like all the professions, psychology, psychiatry, absolutely everything, using alienation. And essentially what they're saying is, if the problem is the system, we can't really ever fix these issues because, you know, all these professions are built under a capitalist system with capitalist ideas. You know, we tend to make people well enough to go back to work as opposed to actually keeping people well. So a wee few points here that I've got, just a few ways of the kind of how to prevent it, but obviously I know that this is what we're going to be chatting about. So according to Marx, you've got two options. Well, kind of one option, revolt and then become communist. However, I feel like that's maybe a wee bit of a strong suggestion at the moment. So the kind of community aspect of taking community out of communism, I personally think, and a lot of the writers think, is the kind of key aspect there. Control and autonomy, and the control that you have over your own work is so important to de-alienating people. And I think unions, for example, we've seen mass decline in trade unions, or trade union representation and membership. And that's something that is potentially damaging for people, because it stops their voice, it stops them being able to, you know, effectively ask for change in some ways. And I think as well, something that would be interesting to talk about just now is the social model and the medical model. So if we're relating to physical or mental health issues, the medical model is the sort of, will make people better because the person is the problem, whereas the social model is looking at, right, what is it about? So for example, if you can't go to work, it's not this person's not well enough to go to work. Instead it is, what can we do in the workplace to improve things for this person? If somebody's got a physical impairment or a mental impairment, it's about changing the kind of the social structures as opposed to them as a person, which I think you'd hope that after COVID, this was all the big changes that were going to be happening, but who knows if it will. That's me sorted with my wee intro. So if anybody's got any questions, I saw the chat going quite a bit there.